I should have known something was wrong when my son Daniel called after 3 years of silence, his voice suddenly warm as he invited me on a bonding trip to the Colorado mountains. At 62, I'd built a $47 million real estate empire from nothing, survived 2 divorces, and conquered every challenge life threw at me. But I couldn't conquer the hollow ache of losing my only child to grief and resentment after his father's death. The drive started perfectly. Daniel seemed genuinely interested in reconnecting, asking about my business, even apologizing for his coldness. I dared to hope my prodigal son had finally come home. But when we reached the isolated mountain road, 40 miles from civilization, his mask slipped. "This is where you get out, Mom," he said, that familiar sneer returning to his handsome face. "Live with the ELK. The Beacon Hill house is mine now." I stood in disbelief as his truck disappeared around the bend, my designer hiking boots suddenly feeling inadequate against the Colorado wilderness. The betrayal cut deeper than the mountain wind. Daniel had orchestrated this elaborate scheme, knowing I'd signed over power of attorney during my recent surgery, a gesture of trust that now felt like signing my own death warrant. But Daniel made one crucial mistake. He underestimated his mother. 15 grueling miles through dense forest, past rushing streams and granite cliffs, I pushed forward on sheer stubborn will. My manicured hands bled from brambles, my silk blouse tore on pine branches, but something inside me hardened with each painful step. This wasn't just survival, it was resurrection. When I finally stumbled into Pine Ridge, a weathered mining town clinging to existence, I found salvation in the form of a payphone outside Murphy's General Store. My fingers trembled as I dialed my attorney's number. "Margaret," I whispered, "do that thing we discussed. The contingency plan we'd established after my divorce. Ironclad legal protections I'd hoped never to use. What Daniel didn't know was that his inheritance was conditional, tied to behavioral clauses and family loyalty requirements I'd embedded in my will years ago. His abandonment had triggered automatic reversions, transferring assets to charitable trusts and distant relatives. The son who'd tried to bury me alive had just buried himself instead. But as FBI agents prepared wire fraud charges and Daniel's perfect plan crumbled around him, I realized the mountains had changed me into someone I barely recognized. The question wasn't whether I could destroy the child who'd betrayed me. It was whether I could find a way to save him. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is forgiveness. And sometimes the only way to truly win is to lose everything you thought mattered and discover what actually does. The wilderness stripped away $47 million, designer clothes, and corporate power. What it revealed underneath was far more dangerous. A mother's love that could survive attempted murder, and a woman strong enough to walk through hell and come back ready to rebuild not just her empire, but her family. Daniel thought he was inheriting my fortune. Instead, he inherited a reckoning 15 miles in the making. I should have trusted my instincts the moment Daniel's name appeared on my phone screen. 3 years of silence, broken by a call on a Tuesday morning in September, while I sat in my corner office overlooking Boston Harbor. The autumn light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where I'd built my real estate empire from nothing. "Mom?" His voice carried that familiar, hesitant quality, like a child testing thin ice. My heart stuttered. After all this time, after all the unanswered calls and returned letters, he was calling me Mom again. "Daniel, is everything okay?" "Yeah, I'm good. Listen, I know things have been rough between us since Dad died, but I've been thinking, maybe it's time we tried to fix this." I set down my Mont Blanc pen, giving him my full attention. Through the window, I could see the harbor where Thomas and I used to sail on weekends, back when we were young and believed love could conquer the Sterling family curse of putting business before everything else. "I'm listening," I said carefully. "I was thinking maybe we could take a trip together. You know, get away from all the Boston noise, spend some real time talking. There's this place in Colorado near Marble Ridge, beautiful hiking trails, mountain air. What do you say?" Colorado. I'd been there once with Thomas, early in our marriage. We'd stayed at a luxury resort in Aspen, but he'd spent most of the time on conference calls while I explored the mountains alone. It seemed fitting that Daniel would choose a place that held such bittersweet memories. "When were you thinking?" I asked, already mentally rearranging my schedule. "This weekend? I know it's short notice, but I don't want to wait anymore, Mom. I've wasted too much time being angry." Something in his voice made my chest tighten. This was the son I remembered, before grief turned him bitter. before he blamed me for not being able to save his father from the heart attack that struck him down at 58. Before he looked at me with those cold blue eyes and said the words that still haunted my sleepless nights. You killed him with all your demands, your constant pushing. He died trying to live up to your impossible standards. Okay, I heard myself saying. Yes, Daniel, I'd love that. The relief in his laugh was palpable. Really? That's great, Mom. I'll pick you up Friday morning, pack light, just hiking gear and warm clothes. After I hung up, I sat staring at the harbor for a long time. Margaret Chen, my attorney and closest friend, knocked on my office door around noon, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop downstairs. You look like someone just told you Christmas was canceled, she said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk. At 45, Margaret was sharp as a blade and twice as cutting when necessary. We'd met in law school before I dropped out to marry Thomas, and she'd been the one to draft my ironclad prenups for both marriages. Daniel called, I said simply. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. Daniel? As in your son Daniel, who hasn't spoken to you since Thomas's funeral? He wants to go on a trip. Colorado. This weekend. And you said yes. It wasn't a question. I nodded, feeling suddenly foolish under her scrutinous gaze. Margaret had warned me after Thomas's death that grief could make people unpredictable, especially when substantial inheritances were involved. Victoria, honey, I love that you're hopeful, but this feels rushed. Why now? Why so suddenly? Maybe he's finally ready to heal, I said, though doubt gnawed at my stomach. Margaret sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Or maybe he's finally ready to claim his inheritance. Have you thought about what happens to your estate if something were to happen to you? The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I'd built sterling properties from a small Boston firm into a national powerhouse worth $47 million. The Beacon Hill mansion alone was worth $3 million. Thomas's life insurance had added another $2 million to the pot. All of it set to pass to Daniel as my only child. Nothing's going to happen to me on a hiking trip, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. I'm not talking about hiking accidents. I'm talking about your power of attorney. My blood chilled. Last month, I'd undergone surgery to remove a benign tumor from my kidney. Standard procedure, but I'd signed temporary power of attorney over to Daniel in case complications arose. The paperwork was still active, wouldn't expire for another 2 weeks. He wouldn't. I started, then stopped. Would he? The Daniel I'd raised, who used to bring me dandelions from the garden and tell me I was the smartest person in the world? Or the Daniel who'd stood at his father's graveside and accused me of being a heartless money machine? Just promise me something, Margaret said, leaning forward. If anything feels off about this trip, anything at all, you call me immediately. And maybe we should implement that contingency plan we discussed. The contingency plan. After my bitter divorce from my second husband, Margaret had suggested building behavioral clauses into my will. Safeguards against family members who might try to manipulate or harm me for money. I'd agreed in theory, but never activated them. Let's wait and see how the weekend goes, I said. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Margaret's expression suggested she thought I was being naive, not paranoid, but she didn't press the issue. Friday morning arrived crisp and clear, with that particular New England bite that promised winter was coming. I stood in front of my walk-in closet, trying to decide between hiking boots I'd worn maybe 3 times and the comfortable sneakers I wore to the gym. The boots won. If I was going to reconnect with my son in the wilderness, I might as well look the part. I'd packed a small duffel bag with practical clothes. Jeans, sweaters, a down jacket I'd bought years ago for a ski trip that never happened. Looking at myself in the full-length mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. At 62, I maintained the kind of polished appearance that intimidated opposing counsel and impressed clients. But stripped of my power suits and stilettos, dressed in hiking gear, I looked vulnerable. Older, human. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 a.m. Through the front window of my Beacon Hill townhouse, I could see Daniel's truck, a beat-up Ford pickup that was a far cry from the BMW I'd given him for his college graduation. He'd sold the BMW, along with most of the gifts I'd given him over the years, in the months after his father's death. I opened the door to find my son looking surprisingly healthy. At 28, he'd inherited his father's tall frame and my stubborn chin, though his dark hair was longer than I remembered, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked, and for a moment his smile looked genuine. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, shouldering my bag. The drive started pleasantly enough. We stopped at a Dunkin' Donuts in Brookline for coffee and Boston cream donuts. Daniel's favorite since childhood. He seemed genuinely interested in my business, asking about recent acquisitions and my plans for the company's expansion into Miami. "You always did have the best eye for potential," he said as we merged onto I-90 West. "Remember that warehouse in Somerville you bought when I was in high school? Everyone thought you were crazy." "It's worth 10 times what I paid now," I said, pleased he remembered. "Your father thought I'd lost my mind." Daniel's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Thomas, but he recovered quickly. "Dad never did understand your vision. He was better with the day-to-day stuff." It was the first time he'd spoken about his father without anger, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this trip really was about healing. We drove through Massachusetts into New York, then west across Pennsylvania. Daniel told me about his job as a freelance graphic designer, about the small apartment he rented in Jamaica Plain, about a woman named Sarah he'd been seeing. Normal conversation between a mother and son, the kind I'd dreamed of for 3 years. Somewhere in Ohio, we stopped for gas and food at a truck stop diner. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, brought us coffee in thick ceramic mugs and called us honey without irony. This was real America, I thought, watching Daniel order a cheeseburger and fries with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't eaten his mother's cooking in years. "You know," he said, picking at his fries, "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately." My stomach clenched. "Oh? About what he would have wanted for us. This fighting, this silence. It's not what he would have wanted." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. His fingers were calloused now, working hands instead of the soft palms of the privileged young man I'd raised. "I've missed you so much," I whispered. He squeezed my hand gently. "I've missed you too, Mom." The moment felt fragile and precious, like holding a butterfly. I didn't want to examine it too closely for fear it might dissolve. We spent the night at a Holiday Inn in Kansas in adjoining rooms. I lay awake for hours, listening to the highway traffic and trying to quiet the nagging voice in my head that whispered warnings. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. Why now? Why so suddenly? But when morning came and I saw Daniel's genuine smile over continental breakfast, I pushed my doubts away. My son was coming back to me. That was all that mattered. The Colorado landscape began to change as we drove deeper into the mountains. Rolling hills gave way to dramatic peaks, and the air grew thin and crystalline. Daniel seemed more relaxed here, away from the familiar tensions of Boston. He rolled down the windows despite the cool temperature, letting the mountain air fill the truck. "Almost there," he said as we turned onto a narrower road that wound up into the foothills. "The trailhead is just ahead." I looked around at the wilderness surrounding us. Dense pine forests stretched in every direction, broken only by granite outcroppings and the occasional glimpse of a distant peak. It was beautiful but intimidating, vast and indifferent to human concerns. "It's pretty remote," I observed. "That's the point," Daniel replied. "No distractions, no phones ringing, just us and nature." He was right about the phones. My cell service had disappeared miles ago. I felt a brief moment of panic at being so disconnected, then forced myself to embrace it. When was the last time I'd been unreachable? When was the last time I'd been anywhere without the constant ping of emails and the pressure of decisions waiting to be made? The truck climbed higher, the road becoming little more than a dirt track carved into the mountainside. I gripped the door handle as we navigated a particularly sharp turn, trying not to look down at the steep drop-off to our right. "You okay?" Daniel asked, noticing my white knuckles. "Just not used to mountain driving," I managed. "We'll be there soon." 20 minutes later, he pulled the truck to a stop in a small clearing. There was no trailhead marker, no parking area, just a gap in the trees where someone had obviously stopped before. The silence was absolute except for the tick of the cooling engine and the whisper of wind through pine needles. "This is it?" I asked, looking around. Daniel was already getting out of the truck, stretching his arms above his head. "This is it. The trail starts just over there." He pointed toward a barely visible break in the forest. I climbed out of the passenger seat, my legs stiff from the long drive. The air was thin and sharp in my lungs, scented with pine and something wilder. The smell of untamed places where humans were visitors, not masters. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. Daniel opened the tailgate and pulled out his backpack, a serious-looking piece of equipment that suggested he'd done this before. My own small day pack looked inadequate by comparison. "Ready for the hike of your life?" he asked. Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. His smile was still there, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something else, something I couldn't quite name. Daniel, how far are we hiking exactly? I'm not in bad shape, but I'm not 25 anymore. Don't worry, Mom. You won't have to go far at all. He shouldered his pack and started walking toward the tree line. I hurried to follow, my boots slipping slightly on the loose pine needles. The trail, if it could be called a trail, was little more than a deer path winding between massive trees. We walked in silence for maybe 10 minutes, climbing steadily. My breath came harder in the thin air, but I was determined not to complain. This was our time together, our chance to rebuild what grief and guilt had torn apart. Daniel stopped suddenly in a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a stunning view of the valley below. The silence was profound, broken only by our breathing and the distant cry of a hawk. "This is perfect," he said, dropping his pack. I looked around, confused. "For lunch? I thought we were hiking to a destination." Daniel turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that made my blood freeze. The mask of warmth and reconciliation had slipped away, replaced by a cold calculation that I recognized from Thomas's worst moments. "Oh, we are at our destination, Mom. I don't understand." He walked back toward me, and I instinctively took a step backward. "You know, I've had 3 years to think about Dad's death. 3 years to think about what you put him through. The stress, the constant pressure to be perfect, to live up to your impossible standards. Daniel, that's not—" "Shut up." The words hit me like a slap. "I'm talking now. You destroyed him piece by piece with your ambition and your demands. He died trying to be the man you wanted instead of the man he was." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Sweetheart, grief can make us think terrible things, but—" I said, "Shut up!" He was shouting now, his face twisted with rage. "You want to know why I brought you here? Because I'm done pretending to be your loving son. I'm done watching you parade around Boston like some kind of business queen while my father rots in the ground." I backed up until I felt a tree trunk against my spine. "Daniel, please. You're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." He walked back to his pack and shouldered it again. "This is where our relationship ends, Mom. Right here, in the middle of nowhere." "What are you talking about?" He gestured broadly at the wilderness around us. "Live with the ELK, Mom. The house in Beacon Hill is mine now." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious. I have power of attorney, remember? By the time anyone realizes you're missing, I'll have liquidated everything. The house, the business, all of it. $47 million is a lot of motivation to finally cut ties with a toxic parent." I stared at him in shock, trying to reconcile this cold stranger with the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "You're my son." "Not anymore." He turned and walked away, heading back toward the truck. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what was happening. Then panic set in. "Daniel, wait! You can't leave me here!" I ran after him, stumbling on the uneven ground. My expensive hiking boots felt clumsy and foreign on my feet. By the time I reached the clearing where we'd parked, the truck's engine was already running. "Daniel, please!" I pounded on the driver's side window. "This is insane! I'm your mother!" He rolled down the window just enough to speak. "You were never a mother. You were a CEO who happened to give birth. The only thing you ever loved was money and power." "That's not true." "Goodbye, Victoria." He always called me Victoria when he was angry, like using my name instead of Mom was a punishment. "Try not to die too quickly. I want you to have time to think about what you've done." The truck lurched forward and I had to jump back to avoid being hit. I watched in disbelief as my only child drove away, leaving me alone in the vast Colorado wilderness with nothing but a small day pack and a growing understanding of just how thoroughly I'd been betrayed. The silence that followed was deafening. No traffic, no city sounds, no human presence except for my own ragged breathing. I was 62 years old, wearing designer hiking boots and a cashmere sweater, abandoned 40 miles from civilization by the son I would have died for. I sank down onto a fallen log and tried to process what had just happened. The power of attorney, the sudden invitation, the remote location. It had all been calculated, planned with the same methodical precision I used in business deals. Daniel had learned more from me than I'd realized. The irony was bitter. I'd spent my life building an empire to leave to him, working 18-hour days to create something lasting and valuable. I'd sacrificed my marriages, my health, my relationships, all for him. And this was how he repaid me. But as the initial shock wore off, something else began to emerge. Anger. Pure, clean rage that burned away the self-pity and confusion. I was Victoria Sterling. I'd built a $47 million business from nothing. I'd survived 2 divorces, corporate sabotage, and every attempt by small-minded men to underestimate me. I was not going to die in these mountains because my ungrateful son wanted his inheritance early. I stood up, adjusted my pack, and looked around. The sun was still high, maybe 3 hours until sunset. I had water, some granola bars, and 40 years of experience making impossible situations work in my favor. I started walking. The first mile was fueled by pure rage. I crashed through the underbrush like a woman possessed, branches catching at my cashmere sweater and pine needles working their way into my boots. Every step was punctuated by silent curses directed at Daniel, at myself for being so naive, at Thomas for dying and leaving me vulnerable to this betrayal. By the second mile, reality began to set in. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the cold understanding of my situation. I was alone in thousands of acres of Colorado wilderness with no cell service, no GPS, and no clear idea which direction led to civilization. The designer hiking boots I'd been so proud of were already raising blisters on my heels. I forced myself to stop and think strategically. Down in the valley, I could see what looked like a creek cutting through the forest. Water meant life, and often, water meant people. Settlements were built near rivers, and rivers flowed toward larger bodies of water, toward towns and cities. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. The descent toward the creek was treacherous. What had looked like gently sloping terrain from above revealed itself to be a maze of fallen logs, rocky outcroppings, and patches of loose scree that sent me sliding several feet with each misstep. My hands were soon scraped raw from grabbing at tree trunks to steady myself. When I finally reached the creek, I knelt beside it and splashed the ice-cold water on my face. It was crystal clear and moving fast, a good sign that it wasn't stagnant. I refilled my water bottle, grateful that I'd at least thought to bring purification tablets on what I'd believed would be a simple day hike. The creek was maybe 4 feet wide and perhaps 2 feet deep at its center. Following it meant walking along the rocky bank, or sometimes right through the water itself. My expensive boots were not designed for creek walking, and within an hour they were soaked through. Each step produced a squelching sound that seemed to echo through the forest. As I walked, I tried to calculate distances and time. I'd been moving for maybe 3 hours since Daniel abandoned me, and I guessed I'd covered about 4 miles of very rough terrain. At this pace, assuming I could maintain it, I might manage 8 to 10 miles before dark. The question was whether that would be enough to reach help. The forest was beautiful in a way that would have taken my breath away under different circumstances. Towering pines created a cathedral-like canopy overhead, and the afternoon light filtered through in golden shafts that illuminated patches of wildflowers. I saw deer tracks in the mud beside the creek, and once, a red fox that watched me curiously from across the water before disappearing into the underbrush. But beauty doesn't fill an empty stomach or warm, cold feet. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, soaked, and beginning to understand just how precarious my situation really was. The temperature was dropping as the sun sank lower, and I'd already eaten both of my granola bars. It was then that I heard the voices. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. The sound of human conversation seemed impossible in this remote place. But as I rounded a bend in the creek, I saw them. 2 men in camouflage standing beside what looked like a hunting blind built into a cluster of aspens. "Help!" I called out, my voice cracking. "Please, I need help!" The men turned toward me, and I could see their surprise at finding a 62-year-old woman in business casual hiking gear stumbling through their hunting camp. The older of the two, a man with a gray beard and kind eyes, waded into the creek to help me up onto the bank. "Jesus, lady, what happened to you?" he asked, steadying me as my legs threatened to give out. "My son," I gasped, suddenly overwhelmed with exhaustion and relief. "He left me, up in the mountains. I've been walking for hours." The younger man, maybe 40, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, brought me a camp chair and a bottle of water. "Left you? What do you mean, left you?" Through chattering teeth, I told them the story. Their expressions grew darker as I spoke, and I could see anger building in their eyes. Not at me, but at Daniel. "That's attempted murder," the older man said flatly. No question about it. His name was Jake Morrison, and he'd been guiding hunting expeditions in these mountains for 30 years. His partner, Rick Valdez, worked for the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department. They were scouting locations for the upcoming elk season when they'd encountered me. "The good news is you're tougher than you look," Jake said, handing me a cup of coffee from their camp stove. "The bad news is you're still about 10 miles from the nearest road, and that's through some rough country. Can you take me out?" I asked. Rick shook his head. We hiked in here 3 days ago. Our truck is back at the trailhead, and that's a 2-day hike from here. But there's another option. He pulled out a topographic map and spread it on a camp table. His finger traced the creek I'd been following. This water eventually feeds into Pine Creek, which runs right past Pine Ridge. It's an old mining town, maybe 200 people, but they've got phones and a sheriff's deputy. If you follow the creek, you should hit the town in maybe 6 or 7 miles. Can you come with me? We would, Jake said, but we're committed to staying here for our survey. However, we can give you some supplies and better directions. They outfitted me with a proper headlamp, a lightweight emergency blanket, and enough food for the journey ahead. Rick marked my map with landmarks to watch for and gave me his GPS coordinates to share with authorities once I reached Pine Ridge. You sure you can do this? Jake asked as I prepared to leave their camp. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I don't have a choice, I replied. What I didn't tell them was that somewhere during those 4 miles of hell, I'd stopped being a victim and become something else entirely. Every blister, every scrape, every moment of fear had forged something harder and more determined inside me. Daniel had tried to break me, but he'd only made me stronger. The next 6 miles were the longest of my life. I walked through gathering darkness, my headlamp creating a small bubble of light in the vast wilderness. The creek became my lifeline, its constant murmur the only sound in a world gone silent and cold. Twice I fell, once sprawling full length in the icy water when a moss-covered rock gave way under my feet. Each time I got up, emptied the water from my boots and kept walking. Stopping wasn't an option, giving up meant dying, and I had too much unfinished business for that. Around midnight, I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was another hallucination brought on by exhaustion and hypothermia. But as I stumbled closer, the lights resolved into the warm glow of windows. Actual buildings. Actual civilization. Pine Ridge was barely a town by most standards. A handful of buildings clustered around a single main street with streetlights that cast yellow pools of light onto cracked asphalt. But to me, it looked like paradise. I made it as far as the front steps of what appeared to be a general store before my legs finally gave out completely. I sat there in the pool of light from a street lamp, shaking with cold and exhaustion, and tried to process the fact that I'd actually survived. A pickup truck rumbled down the main street, and I waved frantically at the headlights. The truck stopped, and a woman got out, middle-aged, wearing scrubs like she was coming off a shift at a hospital. "Oh my God, honey, what happened to you?" she asked, hurrying over to me. "I need a phone," I managed through chattering teeth. "I need to call my lawyer." Her name was Susan Chen, no relation to Margaret, just one of those cosmic coincidences that make you believe in fate. She was a nurse at the clinic in the next town over, driving home from a late shift. She helped me into her truck, cranked up the heat, and drove me to the Pine Ridge Sheriff's substation. Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan looked like he'd been roused from bed, but he listened to my story with growing attention and anger. By the time I finished, he was reaching for his phone. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions for the report, but first, do you want to make that call to your lawyer? There's a payphone outside, but you're welcome to use the office phone." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial Margaret's number. It was 3 a.m. Eastern Time, but she answered on the second ring. "Victoria? Jesus, I've been worried sick. Daniel called me yesterday saying you'd had some kind of accident in Colorado, that you were in a coma and he needed immediate access to your accounts." "Margaret." My voice cut through her babbling like a blade. "Do that thing." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then, "The contingency plan?" "All of it. Every clause, every safeguard, every provision we discussed. Implement them immediately." "What happened?" I told her as briefly as I could. I could hear her typing in the background, already beginning the process that would unravel Daniel's scheme. "Victoria, I need you to know. He's already moved on some of your accounts. Not all, but some. Maybe 3 million so far." The number should have devastated me. Instead, I found myself smiling grimly. "How much time do we have?" "With the behavioral clauses, I can have injunctions filed within hours, freeze everything he hasn't touched yet. The power of attorney becomes void the moment I present evidence of attempted harm. But we need documentation, police reports, witness statements." I looked around the sheriff's office at Deputy Brennan, who was already typing up his report, at Susan Chen, who was giving her statement about finding me. "We'll have documentation." "There's something else," Margaret said. "The behavioral clauses don't just void his inheritance. They trigger automatic transfers to the secondary beneficiaries and charitable trusts. He doesn't just lose his inheritance, he gets nothing. Nothing. The word tasted sweet in my mouth. Daniel had gambled everything on his mother being weak, on his plan being perfect, on getting away with attempted murder for money. He'd lost. Do it, I said. After I hung up, Deputy Brennan took my full statement. Susan Chen insisted on driving me to the clinic in the next town to get checked out, despite my protests that I was fine. I wasn't fine, of course. I was hypothermic, dehydrated, and running on pure adrenaline, but I was alive and I was angry, and that was enough. The clinic was a small facility that mostly dealt with mining accidents and hunting injuries, but they had a warm bed and hot coffee, and the doctor on call was competent enough to treat my various scrapes and bruises. As I lay there waiting for the IV fluids to work their magic, I thought about Daniel. He was probably back in Boston by now, confident that his mother was dying slowly in the Colorado wilderness. He might even be planning the memorial service, practicing his grief-stricken son act for the cameras. The thought of his shock when he discovered what I'd done made me smile despite everything. My phone, which had been dead for hours, finally picked up enough signal to show me 17 missed calls from Margaret and 4 from numbers I didn't recognize. The clock showed 4:47 a.m. Mountain Time. In Boston, Margaret would be in her office, working through the night to unravel my son's betrayal. I closed my eyes and let myself rest for the first time in 18 hours. Tomorrow, there would be more statements to give, more legal documents to sign, more steps in the complex dance of justice and revenge. But tonight, I had survived. Tonight, I had won the first round. When I woke up 6 hours later, Margaret had left a message. It's done. Everything's frozen, and Daniel's been served with papers. The FBI is interested in wire fraud charges. Call me when you can. I looked out the clinic window at the Colorado mountains, their peaks glowing gold in the morning sunlight. They were beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to human drama. They'd almost killed me, but they'd also forged me into something harder and more determined than I'd ever been. I was ready to go home and face whatever came next. The flight back to Boston gave me time to think, which was both a blessing and a curse. I sat in first class. Margaret had arranged everything, including a new wardrobe since my hiking clothes were beyond salvation, and watched the country pass below me. From 30,000 feet, even the Colorado Rockies looked manageable, reduced to wrinkles on a map. My reflection in the airplane window showed someone I barely recognized. The ordeal had carved years off my face in some ways, stripping away the polished veneer I'd worn like armor for decades. But it had also added something else, a hardness around my eyes, a set to my jaw that spoke of battles fought and won. Margaret met me at Logan Airport, her usually perfect composure cracked with exhaustion and what looked like admiration. She embraced me carefully, mindful of my bandaged hands and the bruises that were just beginning to show their full colors. "You look terrible," she said. "I feel terrible, but I'm alive, which is more than my loving son intended." In the car, she briefed me on what had happened in my absence. Daniel had moved fast, accessing 3 of my smaller accounts and liquidating my stock holdings in 2 companies before the freeze went into effect. But the behavioral clauses in my will had worked exactly as designed. The moment I presented evidence of abandonment and attempted harm, everything triggered, Margaret explained as we drove through the familiar streets of Boston. "Your primary will is now void. Daniel gets nothing. Not the house, not the business, nothing. It all goes to the secondary beneficiaries." The secondary beneficiaries. We'd chosen them carefully years ago. My scholarship fund at Boston University, the women's shelter where I'd volunteered after my first divorce, and my nephew Peter, Thomas's brother's son, who'd always been kind to me despite having no expectation of inheritance. How did he react? Like a man who'd just lost $47 million. There was screaming, threats, demands to speak to you. He hired his own lawyer, some ambulance chaser who thinks he can contest the behavioral clauses. He can't, but it'll be expensive for him to learn that. We pulled into the circular driveway of my Beacon Hill townhouse, and I felt a complex mix of emotions. This place had been my sanctuary for 15 years, the symbol of everything I'd built and achieved. Now it felt like a fortress under siege. "There's something else," Margaret said as we sat in the parked car. "The FBI is very interested in the wire fraud charges. Moving money under a power of attorney while attempting to harm the grantor is a federal crime. If convicted, he's looking at 10 to 20 years. 10 to 20 years. My son, my only child, spending his 30s and 40s in federal prison. The thought should have satisfied me, but instead, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. What are the chances he'll be convicted? With your testimony and the evidence, 90% or better. The prosecution is calling it one of the clearest cases of financial elder abuse they've seen. I stared at my house, at the windows glowing warmly in the evening light. Somewhere in the city, Daniel was probably pacing his apartment, trying to figure out how his perfect plan had gone so catastrophically wrong. "I want to see him," I said. Margaret's head snapped toward me. "Victoria, that's not... I want to see my son. He tried to kill you. He's still my son." The meeting took place 3 days later in Margaret's office, neutral territory with plenty of witnesses. Daniel arrived with his lawyer, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who clearly wished he was anywhere else. When the conference room door opened and I saw Daniel for the first time since he'd driven away from that mountain clearing, the air seemed to leave the room. He looked awful. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken with sleepless circles. The confident cruelty he'd worn in Colorado was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Hello, Daniel," I said calmly. He stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. "You're supposed to be dead." "Disappointed?" His lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sterling, we appreciate you agreeing to this meeting. My client would like to..." "Your client would like to what?" I cut him off. "Apologize for attempted murder? Explain why he thought leaving his 62-year-old mother to die in the wilderness was acceptable?" Daniel finally found his voice. "You don't understand. You killed Dad. You killed him with your demands, your constant pushing..." "Stop." The word came out like a whip crack. "Stop hiding behind your father's death to justify what you did. Thomas had a heart condition. He had it for years before it killed him. I didn't cause it. And I didn't cause his death. You made his life miserable. I made his life successful. I made him wealthy. I gave him a son and a family and opportunities he never would have had without me. Was I demanding? Yes. Was I difficult? Probably. Did I love him? Absolutely. Did he love me? Yes, Daniel, he did. Even if you've convinced yourself otherwise." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Boston Harbor where Thomas and I used to sail. "You want to know what killed your father? Stress, yes. But not from me. From you." Daniel's face went white. "That's not..." "The gambling debts he paid off for you in college. The DUI he covered up when you were 25. The job he got you at his firm that you walked away from without notice. The woman you got pregnant and then abandoned, leaving him to deal with the family's threats. Should I go on?" The room was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and Daniel's ragged breathing. "He never told you he knew about any of that, did he?" I continued. "Because he loved you. Because he believed you'd grow up eventually and become the man he knew you could be. The stress that killed him wasn't from my ambition. It was from watching his only son waste every opportunity and break his heart over and over again." Daniel's lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to figure out if any of this information could be used to help his client's case. It couldn't. "I offered you everything," I said, turning back to face my son. "The business, the house, financial security for life. All you had to do was grow up and become worthy of it. Instead, you chose to try to murder me for it." "I didn't mean for you to die," Daniel said quietly. It was the first time he'd shown any hint of remorse. "What did you think would happen? That I'd magically find my way back to civilization and forgive you? That this was just a prank that went too far?" He had no answer for that. Margaret leaned forward. "Daniel, you have exactly one chance to make this marginally better for yourself. The federal prosecutors are preparing charges. If you plead guilty and cooperate fully, they might consider reducing the sentence. If you fight it, you'll lose, and you'll lose badly." "What does that mean for the will?" his lawyer asked. "Nothing," I said. "The behavioral clauses are ironclad. Daniel gets nothing from my estate, whether he's convicted or not." That was decided the moment he abandoned me in Colorado. Daniel's composure finally cracked completely. "You can't do this. I'm your son." "No," I said, my voice steady despite the pain in my chest. "My son would never have tried to kill me for money. My son would have talked to me about his problems instead of plotting my death. I don't know who you are, but you're not the boy I raised." He started to stand, his face flushed with rage, but his lawyer pulled him back down. "There is one thing I'll offer you," I continued. "One final gift from the mother you tried to murder." Everyone in the room leaned forward. "Take the plea deal. Cooperate with the FBI. Accept responsibility for what you've done. Do your time with some dignity, and when you get out, I'll give you $50,000 to start over. Not from my will. From my personal account, as a final act of motherly love. But if you fight these charges, if you continue to blame everyone but yourself for your choices, then you get nothing. Ever. Daniel stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. $50,000 wasn't much compared to the $47 million he'd lost, but it was something. More importantly, it was a lifeline thrown by the woman he'd tried to destroy. I need to think about it, he said finally. You have 24 hours, Margaret said. After that, the offer is withdrawn. The meeting ended with handshakes between the lawyers and careful avoidance of eye contact between Daniel and me. As they prepared to leave, he turned back at the door. "Mom," he said, and for just a moment, he sounded like the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the garden. "I'm sorry." I wanted to run to him, to hold him and tell him everything would be okay. Instead, I stayed where I was. Sorry doesn't undo what you did, Daniel. But it's a start. He took the plea deal. 28 hours later, 4 hours past my deadline, but Margaret convinced me to extend the grace period. Daniel's lawyer called to say his client would plead guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy charges. The sentencing would likely result in 8 to 12 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole in 6. I felt no triumph in his capitulation, only a deep sadness for the waste of it all. Somewhere along the way, I'd failed as a mother. Maybe I had been too demanding, too focused on success and achievement at the expense of nurturing the kind of character that could withstand disappointment and loss. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, media attention, and soul-searching. The story of the business mogul abandoned by her son in the Colorado wilderness captured national attention, turning me into an unwilling symbol of family dysfunction and elder abuse. I gave exactly 3 interviews, all to reputable news organizations, and used each opportunity to talk about the warning signs of financial elder abuse and the importance of legal safeguards. If my humiliation could prevent other families from experiencing this kind of betrayal, then something good might come from it. The business continued to thrive under my leadership, though I made some significant changes. I promoted my assistant manager, a brilliant young woman named Jessica Park, to vice president, and began grooming her to eventually take over operations. At 62, having survived attempted murder by my own son, I was finally ready to admit that building a legacy meant more than just accumulating wealth. I also started therapy, something I'd resisted for decades. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell was a specialist in family trauma and grief, and she helped me understand the complex dynamics that had led to Daniel's desperate act. Not to excuse it. Nothing could excuse attempted murder, but to understand my own role in the dysfunction that had poisoned our relationship. Grief makes people do terrible things, she said during one of our sessions. But so does entitlement, and so does fear of never measuring up to impossible standards. You didn't cause Daniel's choices, but you may have created an environment where he felt those choices were his only option. It was a hard truth to swallow, but necessary for my own healing. 3 months after that terrible day in Colorado, I received a letter from Daniel. He was in federal holding, awaiting transfer to his permanent facility. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten on prison stationery, and it contained something I'd never heard from him before: complete accountability. He wrote about his gambling addiction, which had started in college and never really stopped, about the shame he'd felt watching me succeed while he struggled with depression and self-worth, about how his father's death had broken something inside him, and how much easier it had been to blame me than to face his own grief and failures. He also wrote about the moment he'd driven away from that mountain clearing and the growing horror he'd felt as reality set in, how he'd almost turned around a dozen times but convinced himself it was too late, that I was probably already dead, that he had to see his plan through. "I became a monster," he wrote. "And the worst part is, I became a monster trying to punish you for things that weren't really your fault. Dad's death, my failures, my weakness. None of that was because of you. It was because of me. Because I couldn't be the man you raised me to be, and I couldn't forgive myself for that." The letter ended with something that made me cry for the first time since Thomas's funeral. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't earn your forgiveness or your love, but I want you to know that surviving what I did to you, walking 15 miles through the wilderness and coming out stronger, that's the most amazing thing I've ever seen anyone do. I'm proud to be your son, even if I'm not worthy of it, even if you can never be proud of me." I read that letter 17 times before I was able to set it down. A week later, I wrote back. The correspondence continued throughout his trial and sentencing. Slow, careful letters that began to rebuild something between us. Not the mother-son relationship we'd lost, but something new. Something built on honesty instead of expectation, on acceptance instead of achievement. When Daniel was sentenced to 10 years with possibility of parole in 7, I was there in the courtroom. I didn't speak at his sentencing. The prosecution had asked me to provide a victim impact statement, but I'd declined. What I had to say to Daniel needed to be said privately, not as part of a legal proceeding. After the sentencing, they allowed us 10 minutes together before he was transported to begin serving his sentence. We sat across from each other at a metal table in a room that smelled of disinfectant and despair. "I'm proud of you," I said. He looked up, startled. "What?" "For taking responsibility, for pleading guilty, for the letters you've been writing, for finally being honest about what happened and why. I'm proud of you for that." Tears ran down his face. "I don't deserve—" "No, you don't. But I'm giving it to you anyway, because that's what mothers do. We love our children even when they don't deserve it, even when they try to kill us. I'm going to do better," he said. "In prison, afterwards, I'm going to become the son you wanted." I reached across the table and took his handcuffed hands in mine. "Don't become the son I wanted. Become the man you want to be. That's all I ever really wanted. For you to be happy with who you are. 7 years. That's how long I had to rebuild myself while he rebuilt himself. 7 years to learn how to be someone other than the driven, demanding woman who'd valued achievement over relationship. 7 years for both of us to figure out who we really were underneath all the pain and disappointment. I kept my promise about the $50,000, putting it in an account that would be available to him upon release. But more than that, I kept writing letters. Every week, without fail, I sent him updates about my life, my business, my thoughts and feelings. And every week, he wrote back with his own growth and insights. The mountain changed us both. It stripped away everything superficial and showed us who we really were at our core. For me, it revealed a strength I'd never known I possessed. For Daniel, it revealed the depth of his own capacity for both destruction and redemption. When I visit him now, every month, like clockwork, I see glimpses of the man he's becoming. Someone thoughtful and self-aware. Someone who takes responsibility for his actions and their consequences. Someone who might eventually be worthy of forgiveness. I don't know if our relationship will ever be completely healed. Some betrayals leave permanent scars, and attempted murder is certainly one of them. But I've learned that healing doesn't always mean returning to what was before. Sometimes it means creating something entirely new. The business is thriving under Jessica's leadership. I officially retired as CEO last year, though I remain chairman of the board. The Beacon Hill house is quieter now, but not lonely. I've reconnected with old friends, made new ones, traveled to places I'd always been too busy to visit. And sometimes on autumn evenings when the light slants across Boston Harbor just right, I think about those mountains in Colorado, how they nearly killed me and how they saved me at the same time, how they taught me that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about discovering what's worth living for. I survived my son's betrayal. I survived 15 miles of wilderness with nothing but determination and will. But most importantly, I survived the death of my old self and the birth of someone new. Someone who understands that love without boundaries becomes enabling, that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is holding them accountable for their choices. Daniel will be eligible for parole in 3 years. When that day comes, I'll be there for him. Not as the controlling mother who tried to manage his life, but as the woman who walked through fire and learned what unconditional love really means. The mountains taught me that I was stronger than I knew. Prison is teaching him that he's capable of more growth than he ever imagined. And maybe, if we're both very lucky, we'll meet somewhere in the middle. Not as the people we used to be, but as the people we chose to become. That's the thing about survival. It's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new. My son invited me for a mountain trip and I accepted, arriving in the middle of an abandoned forest. He left me and said, laughing, "Live with the elk, the house is now mine." I couldn't believe it and started crying, thinking it was a bad joke. But after 15 hours of walking through the woods, I arrived in a city and called my lawyer. Do that thing.